What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
For years, Meri Brown has been described using words like difficult, emotional, stubborn, and hard to please. Viewers were encouraged to see her reactions without fully examining what she was reacting to. But when you step back and look at the full timeline, not just moments, not just arguments, not just edited confessionals, a very different story begins to emerge, one that raises a difficult question. How much endurance can one person be expected to give before it stops being strength and starts becoming survival? Meri entered the Brown family as the first wife, the legal wife, and for many years, the emotional anchor of the marriage. She helped build the foundation of a plural family that would later become a television phenomenon. She endured the early instability, the financial uncertainty, the emotional complexity of sharing a husband, and the pressure of representing polygamy to the outside world. From the beginning, her role required sacrifice, but sacrifice was framed as virtue. Endurance was praised. Silence was rewarded. What viewers often forget is that Meri did not sign up to become invisible. In the early seasons of Sister Wives, Meri's pain was frequently minimized. Her struggles were framed as personal shortcomings rather than natural responses to structural imbalance. When she expressed hurt, she was told she was too sensitive. When she pulled back, she was labeled cold. When she stayed loyal, she was described as clingy. No matter what she did, the narrative rarely shifted to ask whether the environment itself was causing the pain. Then came the legal divorce, the turning point that quietly changed everything. On paper, the divorce was presented as a selfless act. Meri was portrayed as generously stepping aside so Kody could legally marry Robin and adopt her children. The family framed it as a technical move, a formality that wouldn't alter relationships or power. Viewers were told nothing would change. But real life doesn't work that way. Legal status carries weight, authority, and protection. Once Meri lost that status, the balance of the family shifted, and it never shifted back. What followed was not an explosion, but an erosion. Meri remained spiritually married, emotionally present, and publicly loyal, yet her position became increasingly undefined. She was no longer the legal wife, but she was still expected to behave as if she held the same authority and security. She was asked to endure uncertainty while being told she was choosing it. Her patience was no longer praised, it was expected. Her silence was no longer respected, it was required. And when she finally began to ask questions, the narrative turned against her. Kody often spoke about Meri as if her pain existed in a vacuum. He framed her unhappiness as something separate from his decisions, separate from the family structure, separate from the divorce itself. This framing allowed him to avoid accountability while positioning Meri as the problem. If she was unhappy, it was because she couldn't move on. If she felt disconnected, it was because she was holding on to hope. But hope in this context wasn't irrational. It was survival. It was the belief that endurance would eventually be rewarded. Instead, endurance became a trap. Meri watched as emotional priorities shifted elsewhere. She watched as decisions were made without her input. She watched as her role in the family became increasingly symbolic rather than substantive. Yet she stayed. She showed up, she filmed, she defended the family publicly even as her private reality grew lonelier. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. At what point does endurance stop being admirable and start being cruel? What makes Meri's story especially difficult is how normalized her suffering became. Viewers grew accustomed to seeing her sidelined. The family grew accustomed to functioning without her emotional inclusion. Even Meri herself seemed to internalize the idea that asking for fairness was somehow unreasonable. When pain becomes routine, it stops being recognized as pain at all. And this is why the title matters. No one should have to endure what Meri Brown has endured, not because she is perfect, not because she made no mistakes, but because no human being should be required to absorb imbalance indefinitely in order to keep peace. Endurance should not be the price of belonging. Loyalty should not require self-erasure. This story is not about assigning villains or rewriting history for shock value. It is about patterns of emotional labor, power imbalance, and narrative control. It is about how systems reward silence and punish discomfort. And it is about how easily a person's humanity can be reduced to a storyline when endurance becomes expected rather than acknowledged. As this series unfolds, we will examine how Meri's role evolved, how language was used to minimize her reality, how legal and emotional authority reshaped the family, and why so many viewers were encouraged to misunderstand her pain. Because when you look closely, Meri's story is not just about plural marriage, it is about what happens when strength is exploited instead of protected. And the most uncomfortable truth of all is this: Meri didn't fail to endure. She endured far longer than anyone should have been asked to. In the beginning, Meri Brown's position in the family carried weight. As the first wife, she wasn't just legally married to Kody, she was the emotional foundation of the household. She shared in the early dreams, the sacrifices, the uncertainty of building a plural family from the ground up. There were no cameras then, no public scrutiny, no production schedules. What existed was trust, expectation, and the belief that loyalty would be reciprocated with security and respect. Being the first wife came with responsibility. Meri helped welcome additional wives into the family, navigating jealousy and insecurity while being expected to rise above it. In polygamous culture, the first wife often sets the tone. She's expected to model acceptance, patience, and emotional maturity. Meri carried that burden quietly. She was encouraged to suppress discomfort for the sake of unity, reinforcing the idea that her value lay in how well she could absorb emotional strain. But over time, that role began to change. As the family expanded, Meri's authority became less defined. Decisions were no longer shared in the same way. Her influence softened, not just through conflict, but through gradual displacement. New dynamics formed, priorities shifted, and Meri found herself navigating a family structure that increasingly functioned without her leadership. What had once been respect slowly became expectation without protection. The arrival of new wives brought complexity, but also comparison. Meri's emotional responses were increasingly contrasted against others, framed as evidence that she struggled to adapt. Where others were praised for flexibility, Meri was criticized for emotional depth. The same behaviors interpreted as strength in others were labeled as weakness in her. This double standard subtly reshaped her identity within the family. Over time, Meri's role transitioned from central to symbolic. She remained present, but her voice carried less influence. She was consulted less, included less, and prioritized less, yet she was still expected to uphold the values of unity and loyalty that define the family. This imbalance created an emotional contradiction. Meri was responsible for maintaining harmony without having the authority to shape it. Kody's leadership style reinforced this shift. Rather than addressing the changing dynamics directly, he often framed Meri's discomfort as resistance. He interpreted her emotional responses as personal flaws, rather than signals of imbalance. This framing allowed him to avoid accountability while positioning Meri as the problem. If she was unhappy, it was because she couldn't move on. If she felt disconnected, it was because she was holding on to hope. But hope in this context wasn't irrational. It was survival. It was the belief that endurance would eventually be rewarded. Instead, endurance became a trap. Meri watched as emotional priorities shifted elsewhere. She watched as decisions were made without her input. She watched as her role in the family became increasingly symbolic rather than substantive. Yet she stayed. She showed up. She filmed, defended the family publicly, even as her private reality grew lonelier. This is where the question becomes unavoidable. At what point does endurance stop being admirable and start being cruel? What makes Meri's story especially difficult is how normalized her suffering became. Viewers grew accustomed to seeing her sidelined. The family grew accustomed to functioning without her emotional inclusion. Even Meri herself seemed to internalize the idea that asking for fairness was somehow unreasonable. When pain becomes routine, it stops being recognized as pain at all. And this is why the title matters. No one should have to endure what Meri Brown has endured, not because she is perfect, not because she made no mistakes, but because no human being should be required to absorb imbalance indefinitely in order to keep peace. Endurance should not be the price of belonging. Loyalty should not require self-erasure. This story is not about assigning villains or rewriting history for shock value. It is about patterns of emotional labor, power imbalance, and narrative control. It is about how systems reward silence and punish discomfort. And it is about how easily a person's humanity can be reduced to a storyline when endurance becomes expected rather than acknowledged. As this series unfolds, we will examine how Meri's role evolved, how language was used to minimize her reality, how legal and emotional authority reshaped the family, and why so many viewers were encouraged to misunderstand her pain. Because when you look closely, Meri's story is not just about plural marriage. It is about what happens when strength is exploited instead of protected.
As Meri Brown's role within the family continued to shift, another pattern quietly took hold, one that is harder to see but far more damaging over time. Emotional labor became her unspoken responsibility. She was expected to manage not only her own feelings, but the emotional temperature of the entire family. When tensions rose, it was often Meri who was expected to smooth them over. When discomfort surfaced, she was encouraged to process it privately rather than disrupt harmony. This expectation was never formalized, yet it was deeply enforced. In plural marriage, emotional labor often falls unevenly, and Meri absorbed a disproportionate share. She was expected to welcome new wives, adapt to shifting priorities, and reassure others of her acceptance, all while navigating her own grief and insecurity. When she succeeded, her effort went unnoticed. When she struggled, her reaction became evidence that she was failing at her role. The labor itself was invisible, but the consequences of faltering were very visible. Over time, endurance became the measure of her worth. Meri's willingness to stay, to try, and to remain loyal was interpreted as agreement. Silence was read as acceptance. Patience was mistaken for contentment. This misinterpretation allowed the family, and particularly Kody, to continue making decisions that disadvantaged her while believing they were justified. After all, if Meri truly objected, wouldn't she leave? Wouldn't she speak up louder? This logic ignores the reality that leaving is not always an available option, especially when identity, faith, finances, and public scrutiny are intertwined. When Meri did speak up, the response often reinforced the expectation that she manage her emotions rather than challenge the system. Her pain was reframed as something she needed to work through internally. The structure itself was rarely questioned. Instead of asking why Meri was hurting, the focus shifted to how she was expressing that hurt. This pattern subtly placed responsibility back on her, absolving others of accountability. Kody's language played a significant role in maintaining this dynamic. He often described Meri as emotional, difficult, or unwilling to move on. These labels did not emerge in a vacuum. They were reactions to her attempts to articulate discomfort. By framing her responses as personality traits rather than situational reactions, he transformed legitimate grievances into perceived character flaws. This reframing made it easier to dismiss her concerns without addressing their source. The emotional labor Meri performed extended beyond private moments. On camera, she was expected to uphold the image of a functioning, united family. Her pain was edited into moments of tension or conflict, reinforcing the narrative that she was the source of disruption. The audience rarely saw the cumulative effort required to maintain composure in a system that continually asked her to give more than it returned. Over time, this imbalance took a psychological toll. Constantly regulating emotions without validation leads to emotional exhaustion. Meri's guardedness, her hesitation, and her moments of withdrawal were not signs of disengagement, they were survival mechanisms. She learned that expressing pain often resulted in further isolation, so she adapted by minimizing herself. Endurance became safer than honesty. This is where the distinction between consent and necessity becomes critical. Meri did not endure because she freely chose suffering. She endured because the alternatives carried risks she was not prepared or allowed to take. Her faith, her family identity, and her public role limited her options. Endurance in this context was not agreement, it was constraint. The tragedy lies in how this endurance was later used against her. Her continued presence was cited as proof that nothing was wrong. Her silence was cited as evidence of acceptance. Her loyalty was interpreted as obligation rather than resilience. The more she endured, the more the system relied on her endurance to justify itself. Understanding this pattern reshapes how we interpret Meri's story. Her emotional responses were not excessive, they were restrained. Her patience was not passive, it was strategic. And her endurance was not endless, it was costly. Emotional labor without recognition erodes a person's sense of self, leaving them unsure whether their pain is even valid. When the Brown family entered the world of reality television, everything changed, but not in the way Meri Brown might have expected. Cameras brought visibility, money, and influence, but they also introduced a new layer of control, the narrative presented to millions of viewers. From that point forward, Meri's private struggles were no longer just family issues. They became content, edited and framed to fit story arcs, conflict beats, and character roles. Reality television thrives on contrast, and Meri was often positioned as the counterweight to harmony. Her emotional responses were isolated, magnified, and repeated, while the context that produced them was frequently minimized or removed entirely. Viewers were shown moments of tension without seeing the long stretches of endurance that preceded them. Pain was condensed into reaction shots, confessionals, and arguments, turning years of emotional labor into a handful of digestible scenes. This framing had consequences. As episodes aired, public perception began to solidify around a simplified version of Meri. She became the difficult wife, the unhappy one, the problem. These labels followed her from season to season, reinforced by editing choices that emphasized conflict over context. Moments of vulnerability were rarely allowed to stand alone. They were paired with commentary that questioned her motives or emotional stability. Over time, empathy was replaced with judgment. What viewers did not see were the countless moments Meri held herself together off camera. They did not see the private compromises, the unacknowledged sacrifices, or the emotional recalibration required to function in a system that continually sidelined her. Reality television rarely captures endurance, it captures reaction, and reaction without context is easily misinterpreted. The power of editing lies not in fabrication but in omission. By selecting certain moments and excluding others, producers shape understanding. In Meri's case, the omission of structural imbalance made her pain appear self-generated. Without seeing the gradual erosion of her role, viewers were encouraged to believe that her unhappiness was a personal issue rather than a systemic one. Kody's on-camera narratives further reinforced this perception. His language often framed Meri's struggles as choices she made rather than conditions she endured. These statements, delivered confidently and repeatedly, became the lens through which many viewers interpreted her behavior. The audience response mirrored this framing. Online discussions frequently criticized Meri for staying, for hoping, for not leaving sooner. Rarely was the question asked, what did staying cost her?
Reality television trained viewers to evaluate outcomes without examining constraints. Endurance was mistaken for weakness. Silence was interpreted as consent. Pain was reduced to personality. This public misunderstanding compounded Meri's isolation. She was not only navigating marginalization within her family, but also criticism from an audience that believed they understood her story. The gap between lived experience and public perception widened, leaving little space for nuance or compassion. When a person's pain is misunderstood at scale, it becomes harder for them to validate their own experience. Yet there is a deeper layer to consider. Reality television did not create Meri's suffering, but it normalized it. By repeatedly portraying her pain without resolution, the show trained viewers to accept her unhappiness as a static trait, rather than a signal of harm. Her endurance became a feature of the show, expected, familiar, and ultimately overlooked. This normalization is dangerous because it blurs the line between documentation and exploitation. When someone's distress becomes part of the entertainment landscape, it risks being consumed rather than addressed. Meri's story became something viewers debated, rather than something that demanded empathy. Understanding this dynamic is essential to re-examining Meri's journey. Her portrayal was not neutral. It was shaped by production choices, narrative priorities, and cultural assumptions about endurance and emotional expression. The result was a public narrative that rarely asked whether what Meri was enduring was fair, only whether it was dramatic enough to be compelling television.
The legal divorce between Meri Brown and Kody Brown was presented to the public as an act of love and selflessness. Viewers were told it was a necessary step to ensure stability for Robyn's children and to strengthen the family as a whole. The language surrounding the decision was calm, cooperative, and reassuring. Everyone emphasized that nothing would truly change. The marriage, they said, was still intact spiritually. The relationships, they said, would remain the same. But legal structures exist for a reason, and once they change, everything else follows. When Meri signed the divorce papers, she gave up more than a legal title. She relinquished protections that had quietly supported her position in the family for decades. Legal marriage confers rights, financial security, inheritance claims, decision-making authority, and recognized status. Losing those rights fundamentally altered Meri's standing, even if the emotional narrative insisted otherwise. What makes this moment especially painful is the imbalance of risk. Meri assumed all of it. She trusted that the family's promises would compensate for what the law no longer protected. She trusted that loyalty would be reciprocated with fairness. She trusted that sacrifice would be honored rather than exploited. But trust without structure leaves a person vulnerable, and Meri's vulnerability was not temporary, it became permanent. The aftermath of the divorce revealed how fragile those assurances were. Decisions increasingly centered around the legal wife's household. Financial priorities shifted. Authority consolidated. Meri's role became ambiguous, still emotionally bound but structurally exposed. She remained expected to contribute, support, and endure, yet she no longer had formal standing to advocate for herself. Kody's framing of the divorce minimized these consequences. He described it as paperwork, a technicality, something that did not alter the emotional reality of the family. This framing served a purpose. By downplaying the significance of the legal shift, he avoided confronting the imbalance it created. If nothing changed, then no one was harmed. If no one was harmed, then no accountability was required. But reality told a different story. Meri's sense of security eroded quickly. Without legal protection, her future became uncertain. She had no guarantees, no enforceable agreements, no safeguards if relationships deteriorated further. The divorce stripped away not just status, but leverage. In a family where decisions were increasingly centralized, this loss was profound. What followed was not immediate rejection, but quiet exclusion. Meri was still present, still loyal, still committed, yet she was no longer essential to the functioning of the family. Her voice carried less weight, her needs were easier to overlook. The system had changed, even if the language around it had not. This moment also exposed a deeper contradiction. Meri was praised for her selflessness, yet her sacrifice was treated as a given rather than a gift. Gratitude faded quickly. The family moved forward while Meri was left navigating the consequences alone. Her endurance, once again, became the expectation rather than the exception. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the divorce is how it reframed Meri's pain. Any discomfort she expressed afterward could be dismissed as regret, insecurity, or inability to move on. The structural loss she experienced was rarely acknowledged. Instead, the narrative suggested that her continued struggle was a personal failure, rather than a predictable outcome of diminished protection and power. This reframing isolated her further. Without recognition of the real cost of the divorce, Meri was left questioning her own reality. Was she wrong to feel unsettled? Was she ungrateful for the opportunity to help the family? These doubts are not signs of weakness. They are the result of being asked to sacrifice without validation. The legal divorce did not create Meri's suffering, but it cemented it. What had once been emotional imbalance became formalized inequality. The safety net disappeared, replaced by promises that carried no enforcement. And in that shift, Meri was asked to endure once again, this time without protection. After the divorce, Meri Brown's position in the Brown family became increasingly precarious.
Legally, she had given up rights and protections, but emotionally, she remained deeply intertwined with a family that no longer recognized her authority. She was present for events, filmed for television, and continued to support the family's public image. Yet her influence, her priority, and her security had all diminished. This created a state of emotional limbo. Meri existed in a space where she was expected to participate fully, contribute emotionally, and maintain appearances, but her contributions no longer carried the weight they once did. She was part of the household, yet on the periphery. Her voice mattered less in decision-making. Her needs were subordinated to those of other wives. And because her endurance had been normalized over decades, the family assumed she would continue without complaint. The combination of legal marginalization and emotional expectation placed an enormous strain on Meri. She was navigating the complexity of remaining loyal while simultaneously being sidelined. Her silence was treated as agreement, and her patience was interpreted as consent. Yet internally, she grappled with frustration, sadness, and a profound sense of invisibility. Public perception compounded the struggle. Fans, guided by edited television narratives, often misunderstood Meri's reactions. Moments of assertiveness were labeled nagging or complaining, while her quiet endurance was overlooked entirely. The media rarely highlighted the structural imbalance that caused her pain, focusing instead on superficial drama. Over time, this emotional limbo had real consequences. Meri's sense of self and confidence were challenged, as she learned to navigate a world where her feelings were acknowledged only when convenient. The disconnect between her internal reality and external expectations became a constant source of tension. In addition, the family dynamics continued to evolve. Newer wives gained prominence, legal advantages, and emotional priority. The redistribution of attention and authority left Meri increasingly isolated. She had to adjust to a role where her contributions were no longer central, yet her commitment and endurance were still expected in full measure. The result was a complex emotional calculus. Participate fully but risk marginalization, speak up but risk judgment, remain silent but risk invisibility. There was no ideal path, only compromise and endurance. And because endurance had been her defining trait for so long, Meri continued to navigate this limbo with remarkable resilience, even as it took an emotional toll. This period demonstrates how structural inequality can be hidden behind appearances of stability. The divorce may have been officially over, but the underlying patterns of power, expectation, and narrative control persisted. Meri was asked to endure, yet without the recognition, authority, or support that would make such endurance sustainable.
As the years passed after the divorce, Meri Brown's marginalization began to ripple through multiple areas of her life. She was no longer just enduring for herself. She was enduring for her children, for her co-wives, and for a public that rarely understood her reality. Each of these spheres carried its own set of pressures, expectations, and emotional demands. Within the family, Meri continued to engage with her children, navigating both her role as a mother and the complex dynamics of plural marriage. She was expected to maintain stability, provide guidance, and model loyalty, all while feeling sidelined in decision-making. Her children observed these dynamics and were forced to navigate them as well. While Meri attempted to shield them from conflict, she could not entirely protect them from the realities of her diminished authority. In doing so, she absorbed additional emotional labor, taking on responsibility for maintaining family cohesion even as her own sense of priority eroded. Interactions with co-wives added another layer of complexity. With Robin elevated as the legal wife and central figure in the family's narrative, Meri's position was continually compared and measured. She was expected to accept decisions that favored others, offer support when asked, and refrain from expressing dissatisfaction that might disrupt appearances of unity. Even when disagreements arose, she was subtly framed as the instigator, the overly emotional one, or the resistant participant. Her voice, once influential, was now often overshadowed. Meanwhile, the public perception created by reality television amplified the burden. Fans consumed selective depictions of her reactions without understanding the structural pressures behind them. Moments of assertiveness were labeled as complaints, while patience and silence were interpreted as weakness or passivity. The pressure to maintain a composed and cooperative public persona, despite private frustration, further strained her emotional resources. Endurance was expected both on camera and off, blurring the line between personal resilience and exhausting. Over time, these compounded pressures began to manifest as emotional fatigue. Meri had been enduring for decades, but decades of under-recognized labor, emotional, social, and structural, take a profound toll. The cumulative effect is not simply stress, it is an erosion of the sense that one's feelings, contributions, and needs matter. Every decision made without her input, every public narrative that misrepresented her experience, and every subtle dismissal of her emotional reality added layers to this exhaustion. Yet Meri continued to persevere. Her endurance had become both her shield and her burden, a way to maintain family stability, protect her children, and navigate the scrutiny of the public eye. But it was not without cost.
Her resilience was repeatedly tested, revealing the human limits of patience, loyalty, and commitment under conditions of persistent marginalization. This period highlights a critical tension. Endurance can be admirable, but when expected without recognition, it becomes unsustainable. Meri's journey demonstrates the thin line between resilience and exploitation, between loyalty and self-erasure. Her struggle reflects the broader challenge faced by anyone whose efforts are consistently unrecognized yet relied upon. One of the most insidious forces affecting Meri Brown after the divorce was narrative control. The story of her life and experiences was no longer entirely her own. It was filtered through the lens of Kody Brown, the family system, and the production team behind Sister Wives. Every word spoken, every reaction captured on camera was selected, edited, and positioned to fit a story that emphasized drama and entertainment rather than truth. Kody, as both the central figure and the family's authority, played a key role in shaping this narrative. His public statements and on-camera demeanor often framed Meri's reactions as personal flaws, emotional instability, or reluctance to move on. By presenting her responses as overreactions or choices rather than consequences of structural imbalance, he shifted responsibility away from himself and the system that marginalized her. What might have been recognized as justified frustration instead became fodder for judgment. Reality TV editing amplified this effect. Long stretches of patience, compromise, and quiet endurance were compressed into brief segments. Moments of tension were highlighted and replayed, often stripped of context. The audience saw snapshots, not the years of sacrifice and emotional labor that underpin them. Consequently, Meri's resilience was interpreted as stubbornness, silence as passivity, and her complaints as unnecessary drama. This narrative control did more than misrepresent her, it reinforced her marginalization. When the family, the cameras, and the editing process all minimize a person's perspective, it becomes increasingly difficult for that individual to assert their reality. Meri's attempts to speak up were often met with both internal and external skepticism. On one hand, the family system discounted her concerns. On the other, public opinion, shaped by selective storytelling, questioned her motives and judged her character. Over time, the dissonance between lived experience and public perception became a source of emotional strain. Meri found herself caught in a paradox. She was expected to endure silently, maintain harmony, and be cooperative, yet she also faced criticism for the very emotions that her circumstances justified. This relentless cycle created a pressure cooker environment, where her endurance was stretched to its limits and her voice continually undermined. The compounding effect of narrative control highlights a key lesson. When someone's story is filtered through the lens of power, entertainment, or selective framing, endurance can easily be mistaken for complicity. The public sees a version of events crafted for impact, while the individual experiences the unedited, cumulative toll of structural inequality. Meri's pain was both real and minimized simultaneously, a contradiction that left her navigating emotional isolation on multiple fronts. Understanding this dynamic is essential to appreciating the full weight of what Meri has endured. It wasn't just the divorce, the legal marginalization, or the shifts in family authority. It was also the way her reality was constantly reframed, reduced, and scrutinized for entertainment value. The system demanded endurance while denying recognition, and the public, guided by selective narratives, rarely saw the truth behind her sacrifices.
As the years progressed, the cumulative effects of marginalization, emotional labor, and narrative control began to take a profound toll on Meri Brown's sense of self. Endurance, which had once been a source of pride and strength, gradually became a double-edged sword, a measure of loyalty that simultaneously diminished her identity. The more she adapted, compromised, and remained present, the more her position within the family and public perception seemed to erode. Meri's sense of self-worth was constantly challenged. In a family system where authority and priority were increasingly concentrated elsewhere, her contributions were often overlooked or minimized. Her emotional labor, the countless hours spent maintaining harmony, managing conflicts, and supporting others, was invisible yet expected. Recognition, when it came, was superficial and conditional, reinforcing the perception that her sacrifices were not extraordinary, but simply part of her role. The public narrative further complicated matters. Viewers, guided by selective storytelling and edited moments of tension, frequently judged her actions without understanding context. Assertiveness was interpreted as difficulty. Patience was misread as passivity. Resilience was assumed to be innate rather than a response to sustained pressure. This misalignment between reality and perception made it difficult for Meri to fully trust her own experiences. She was navigating the constant question, am I overreacting or is my suffering justified? Over time, the burden of this emotional dissonance became heavy. Meri's internal dialogue reflected years of managing not only the family's expectations, but also the lens of public scrutiny. Each decision, each compromise, each act of endurance required negotiation between self-preservation and loyalty. The more she tried to protect her relationships and maintain unity, the more she had to suppress or rationalize her own feelings. This prolonged strain affected her emotional resilience. While endurance had once been a tool to navigate adversity,
repeated marginalization and structural imbalance turned it into a source of exhaustion. Moments of assertiveness could trigger criticism. Moments of vulnerability could be minimized. The family system and public perception created a feedback loop in which Meri's efforts to maintain stability were interpreted as compliance, while her attempts to assert herself were framed as emotional volatility. Yet, despite this, Meri continued to persevere. Her endurance, resilience, and quiet strength remained remarkable. Even under constant structural and emotional pressure, she continued to show up for her children, support her co-wives when possible, and maintain the integrity of the family unit. However, the personal cost was undeniable. Long-term emotional fatigue, a constant recalibration of self-worth, and a sense that her reality was never fully acknowledged. Understanding this stage of Meri's journey is critical to comprehending the full impact of her experience. It demonstrates that endurance without recognition can erode identity, diminish confidence, and create a sustained internal struggle. It also highlights the courage required to persist in an environment that demands loyalty while minimizing acknowledgement, empathy, and validation. Meri Brown's story is more than a tale of one woman navigating a complex family structure. It is a lens through which we can examine endurance, resilience, and the human cost of structural imbalance. Across decades of plural marriage, legal adjustments, and public scrutiny, Meri demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to endure, yet her endurance was not without consequence. The very traits that made her a stabilizing force became the source of sustained vulnerability. By the end of her journey, the lessons are clear. Endurance is not inherently admirable when it comes at the expense of recognition, fairness, and self-preservation. Meri's loyalty, patience, and emotional labor were extraordinary, but they were expected rather than celebrated. Her sacrifices were normalized, her resilience taken for granted, and her pain reframed to suit narratives that often ignored the structural inequities shaping her experience. Her story also reminds us that structural imbalance, when unacknowledged, can turn endurance into exploitation. In Meri's case, legal marginalization, shifting authority within the family, and selective media narratives combined to create an environment where her continued presence was interpreted as consent rather than survival. Her emotional labor, both private and public, went largely unseen, and her attempts to assert herself were misinterpreted. This dynamic highlights the importance of recognizing the conditions under which endurance occurs, rather than simply celebrating the endurance itself. There is also a lesson in public perception. Reality television, social media commentary, and selective storytelling shaped the lens through which audiences viewed Meri. Moments of patience were undervalued, moments of frustration were exaggerated. By misunderstanding the context behind her endurance, viewers were invited to judge without empathy. Meri's journey underscores the need for critical engagement, to look beyond surface-level narratives, to consider structural influences, and to honor the humanity behind public personas. Finally, her story is a testament to quiet courage. Despite marginalization, repeated challenges, and emotional fatigue, Meri remained committed to her family and her values. She navigated impossible contradictions with dignity, balancing loyalty with self-preservation and endurance with resilience. Her journey reminds us that true strength is not just about surviving adversity. It is about maintaining integrity, advocating for oneself when possible, and refusing to let structural imbalance erase one's humanity. In reflecting on Meri Brown's experience, it becomes clear that no one should have to endure what she endured. Her story is a call for empathy, for recognition of emotional labor, and for a more nuanced understanding of human resilience. It is a story that encourages viewers to question assumptions, challenge oversimplified narratives, and honor the complexity of enduring hardship in the face of systemic inequality. Meri Brown's journey is both cautionary and inspiring, a reminder that endurance without fairness is a heavy burden, and that true recognition requires not just admiration, but structural support, empathy, and acknowledgement of the full human experience.